I'm Matthew Welch, and I'm going to discuss the systemic human rights assessments that we carry out at DPAM. Now, before this, I would need a little bit of help on your side. You can see two companies here, Apple and Starbucks. Now, let's do a small thought experiment. You are a responsible investor, and let's say human rights is your highest possible value. And my question to you now is, you can only exclude one company. Which company would you exclude between either Apple or Starbucks when you talk about human rights? So if you have to exclude one company, which one would it be? And I would like a show of hands. Who would like to exclude Apple based on human rights issues? Yep, great. And who would exclude Starbucks? Okay, so more people for Starbucks. Okay, maybe first, I think you put your hands up for Apple. What is the main reason you would exclude it?
Possibly linked with the previous speaker, the extraction and the value chain where they get their...
Extraction, yeah, indeed. Yeah, good possibility. There was another Apple over there, I think. No? Yes.
The same opinion as...
Conflict minerals, yeah, indeed. Well, there are quite some. As you can say, yeah, conflict minerals, what you mentioned. They also face a major fine by the European Commission due to infringing some digital rights. They're also being sued because they don't have proper systems in place to actually address child sexual abuse material. So there's a whole lot to discuss about human rights and Apple. Starbucks, I think you had a Starbucks over there. Maybe a reason why we would exclude Starbucks? Antoon, I think you put your hand up.
Well, exploitation of coffee is always...
Coffee supply chain, yes, a good one. And we had another Starbucks over here. Labor issues, well, yeah, that's it. So indeed, we've gotten a problem with the sourcing of coffee. But yeah, Starbucks is also very prolific in trying to block organized labor. So this is just to illustrate you that human rights are very, very broad, okay? Because here we do to companies who talk about forced labor, we talk about child labor, we talk about digital rights, we talk about supply chain issues, we talk about a whole set of elements that all fall under the umbrella of human rights. So it's a complex topic. Now, why does this topic take center stage? What is the main reason why we've got now, this seminar on human rights? One of the key elements is regulation, unfortunately. Now, I could show you a slide on the share price drop of a company after having faced a human rights risk. But actually, when we talk to companies themselves, we see that the regulation aspect is the one that is more convincing companies to do something about human rights. So that's also why I show you regulations today. So we've got the two first one, CSDDD. Sim already mentioned it, Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, where companies will have to report on their due diligence in their value chain, both up and downstream. We've got a CSRD, Reporting Directive, where companies will have to report on how they're going to first, map their risks they're exposed to, and afterwards also disclose how they're going to face these risks. We've got the Anti-Forced Labor Regulation by the European Parliament, and hopefully will come into force soon. And we've got the deforestation regulation, where certain products will need to demonstrate that they don't infringe human rights. Now, this has been put on the back burner by the Commission for a year. And unfortunately, this is also something that we see for other regulations, because Mrs. van der Leyen came with her omnibus. That's the biggest picture of a bus I could find. She came with her omnibus, and so we don't know yet what is going to happen. Are we moving towards a deregulation or an alignment of regulation? So, what I can tell you still is that regulation is moving in the right direction. Regulation is taking into consideration human rights, but it's to be seen in where we're going to land at the end when everything is over. So this is the main reason why we talk about social risks. And we already know that social risks are quite broad, as we saw in the first slide. Now, how do we anticipate human rights infringements? The two hands that you can see in the middle are representing a human rights infringement. So we can look at the infringement ex post or ex ante. Now, ex post, I mean looking at a human rights issue when the issue already occurred, okay? And for this, we have certain screens and checks in place that are probably very familiar to you all. The first is the normative screening. We're going to exclude companies in breach with the Global Compact principles, the set of 10 principles, and those include human rights. So if a company is in breach with these principles, we'll exclude the company. But of course, these companies already had an infringement of human rights that took place. A controversial behavior analysis, where again, we're going to look at the behavior of a company. And very often this behavior can be put on a scale from 0 to 5, with 5 the most severe controversy. We're going to exclude everything related to controversies level 5, so with a high impact. And we're going to systematically discuss the controversies level 3, negative, and 4. So again, we're going to discuss when a company has done something wrong. We're going to come together with our SRI team, with our investors, with our CEO, with our PMs, and understand how severe the controversial behavior of a company has been. Controversial activities analysis, well, we're going to exclude companies in our responsible investment range that are active in gambling, pornography, etc., which is a whole set also of issues that we don't want to be exposed to. But again, these are issues that already occurred. And then lastly, our fundamental ESG analysis. I will not go into detail, but we do also a fundamental analysis of our companies on ESG, which of course includes human rights. Now, as you can see here, this is all ex post, so the issue already occurred. So what we want to do is actually look at how can we anticipate a company to see whether or not they are likely to infringe human rights. And I mean, if you think about climate, you've got the 1.5 degrees. Everybody knows this, okay? And you can look at the trajectory of a company and say if a company is on trajectory or not. And very often I receive the comment, look, but human rights, we don't have something like that. It's more complex, it's more subjective. Well, then I say, no, that's not true. Because you've got, as Selim before showed, you've got rules, you've got international regulations that are actually describing what companies should do. So next time you talk to your climate colleague, and the climate colleague says, well, we've got the 1.5, well, then you can say, well, we've got the OECD. Because we have these institutions, we have these regulations that has been accepted by a wide range of countries, and that we can push our investing companies to also put into place. So how we do our ex-ante analysis? Well, we ourselves apply the OECD guidelines, and we push our investee companies to also use the OECD guidelines to properly carry out their due diligence. Now, what do these guidelines look like? I will not go into detail because otherwise I would spoil a very interesting read for you, because they are really interesting to read. But it starts with, well, first embedding your human rights commitments into your policies and management systems. Starts with this, okay? And an important part here is that it should be supported by your top management. It's the case at DPAM, and it's also the case if we severely engage with a company. We push them to have a policy that is supported by top management. We don't want to have a ESG team that is working in a corner somewhere and that sometimes sends a report. We want to have an ESG team that is embedded throughout the procurement, legal, HR, etc. Then, a second is identify and assess adverse impacts. So basically, put in place a proper due diligence system. 3 is seize, prevent, and mitigate adverse impacts. 4 is tracking the impacts. 5, communicate. And 6, provide cooperation in remediation. Now, the OECD guidelines are super interesting, and they also wrote documents specific for certain industries. So if you talk to a company active in conflict minerals, for example, take the OECD guidelines on conflict minerals. If you talk to an asset manager, well, take the OECD guidelines written specifically for asset managers. And I'm going to do a small check here. PRI, so Selim, I'm going to associate with PRI. So Selim wrote a beautiful piece that actually translated the OECD guidelines for asset managers in something easier to read, or nicer to read. It's, I think, a 10-page document by PRI, which really explains what is expected from asset managers to implement the OECD guidelines. Anyhow, so we implement this, and we also ask our companies to implement this. Now, how do we implement these different steps? First off, we start with a general ESG integration, which I explained before. It's the controversies, is the ESG analysis, etc., etc. But next to this, we also identify 5 high-risk sectors. The first 4 ones are more or less aligned with what the OECD prescribed as a high-risk sector for infringing human rights. And we also decided To take the last one, digital platforms and telecommunication companies. Reason why is, well, because we see that very often we see that the human rights discussions also merge into the digital sphere, and so you start to talk more and more about digital rights. Recently I was in Geneva for the UN Forum on Business and Human Rights, a very interesting forum. Well, I think 1/3 of the panels there were about AI and human rights. So, I mean, we can see that it's something that's being emerging. Anyway, so we check our exposure to these 5 sectors. And each trimester, we see within these sectors what the at-risk companies are. Now, how do we do this? First, we check the social controversy. So again, a little bit of backward looking, but we look at social controversies as of 2. Why? Well, because we don't think that ESG data providers are always right. Sometimes they put a 2 where we believe it's a 4, etc., etc. And especially when we talk about human rights. Sometimes we use ESG data providers to map our controversies. Well, sometimes they map something as being a 2, which we consider actually to be very problematic. So we already lower the threshold to 2 to look at companies. Second is we use the World Benchmarking Alliance social benchmark. WBA for France, World Benchmarking Alliance, WBA, has a benchmark of 2,000 companies. Well, we rank the companies on how well they apply the OECD guidelines. We use this ranking, and we cut off the bottom 40% of companies in this ranking, and we estimate that if a company is in the bottom 40% and is inactive in one of these 5 high-risk sectors, it might have an issue with mapping, or at least trying to find human rights infringements in their operations. And third is a specific industry ranking. What is this? Well, we started with the 2 companies that we discussed, and you could see that they face a whole set of issues that are very wide-ranging. Now, we investors cannot be an expert in everything. So what we do is we use an industry-specific ranking that ranks companies based on their salient issues that they're facing. For example, when we talk about digital platforms, we use Ranking Digital Rights, an NGO that has now been taken over by WBA, I think, that is ranking big IT players on how well they're actually anticipating freedom of expression, privacy, and governance of digital rights. So we're using these specific rankings to map the salient issues of each industry. In case a company is being tagged by one of these 3 elements, we will do a deep dive analysis. What does that mean? Well, ourselves, we're going to set up a scorecard, and we're going to look at the different issues that a company is facing and see how well they apply their policy. Do they have certain policies on human rights? Is it based on OECD guidelines? Is it supported by top management? And we're also going to look at the salient issues. Are the issues rather in the upstream, on operations, or downstream of the company? And based on that, we're going to say, okay, look, the company is properly managing its risk, or we're going to engage with the company. And I'll come back to that later. And last thing that we do as well is that we systematically vote against the chairman when severe lack of due diligence occurs. Again, we use, it's a little bit on the bottom of the chairs, so I try to say what is on there. So also here we're using certain rankings that is going to rank a company based on their due diligence practices. And if we see that a company has absolutely nothing in place on due diligence, we're going to vote against the chairman and send them a letter where we explain, look, we vote against you because of these and these reasons. Would you like to engage with us? So here again, we try to make the link between what we assess, what we engage with, and how we vote against the board. To make the link between what we want to talk to management and actually the interest that the board might have on this as well. Now, I stole this beautiful picture from PRI because it properly explains what is expected from us as investors when we see an actual or potential human rights breach. If you go on the left, or wait, on your left here, you can see that the first is, well, if the investor has leverage, it should try to prevent, mitigate, and enable remedy of a human rights infringement. If we don't have enough leverage, we have to seek to increase the leverage. Now, as an investor, how can we do this? Well, we can try to buy more shares, but of course this might be against the interest of our clients, against our fiduciary duty. So what we do is we try to group together other investors that think like us, investors that are also putting human rights quite high on the agenda and are having a share of the company. And together, we can actually try to approach a company to say, like, look, at least X% of your assets are expecting this from top management. And therefore, you need to implement this. And so we actually follow what the PRI and OECD guidelines say, meaning that we increase our leverage in order to push our companies to do better. And afterwards, well, we see invest in and keep engaging, or we divest and communicate about this. Now, I mentioned some collaboration that we do with investors. These are some of them. So we have the World Benchmarking Alliance, where we have it's called a Collective Impact Coalition, but where we are part of a KIC, where we engage on ethical AI and the use of ethical AI. So we're going to reach out to companies together with other investors to understand how they apply these principles. On the top right, you've got the Investor Alliance for Human Rights, wonderful people, and they actually have certain processes or projects in place to map certain human rights risks. And so with them, we work a lot on the Xinjiang problematic in China, for example. On the bottom left, you've got 3 organizations, because it's a project with 3 organizations, with Investor Alliance, Peace Nexus, and Heartland Initiative, where we have a pilot project to map risks related to conflict-affected and high-risk areas. An issue that is, with everything that's happening now in Europe, for example, or in the Middle East, is getting a lot of traction. And then on the bottom right, Advance, you're all familiar with Advance now. We're taking the lead on 2 companies in the advance engagement sphere. But why is this important is because I believe that we will never be able to reach this alone. We are only an investor in Brussels. We're not a BlackRock. And so the only way that we can change companies is to collaborate around a company and collaborate with each other. And I think that, or at least my experience is that in human rights sphere, this collaboration takes place a lot, and I think we can learn a lot from each other as well. Now I'm going to skip this one, but maybe I'm going to move to the key messages. The first key message that I want to share with you is use external data with deep knowledge on salient issues specific for industries. Now, I think each word in this sentence is important. Why? Well, I'm pushing you to use external data. This does not mean to use always ESG data providers, because what I put in the sentence as well is with deep knowledge about salient issues, and I can tell you that very often ESG data providers do not have a deep knowledge about salient issues. So I'm pushing you to actually use data from NGOs, from civil society, to properly understand what the issue of a company is, and to also have discussions with civil society and experts on the topic. An example of this is, well, very recently, very recently, there was an issue with a company in Africa. We'll not delve into detail because we're still engaging. And it was not flagged by any data provider. So what did we do? Well, we talked to the company 3-4 times. And eventually, well, there was one article written about this controversy. We reached out to the journalists. And we said, like, look, the company is saying that this did not happen. You wrote in your article it did happen. So can we have a conversation with you to understand what your sources are, to understand how you did your analysis? And only thanks to this discussion with the journalists are we actually aware of what happened with the company. And so I want to push this because you really have to think out of the box when you talk about human rights. You have to really delve into the issue itself and really investigate in depth. Second is a quote of my grandfather. I don't think he invented it, but on n'est jamais mieux servi que par soi-même. If you want a job well done, you better do it yourself. It goes a little bit in contradiction with the previous statement, but it's just to state that you should not always take the data of ESG data providers for granted. Each data provider also has its bias, either geographical or on certain issues. And so combining sources is key. That's why we're not always using a data provider to map all our social risks. We use a mix of different data providers, a mix of different civil society actors to properly map our issues. Third, and that's an important one, is talk to the affected stakeholders of an industry to understand what you should expect from companies. We as investors, we can talk about a social risk, okay? You can say, for example, you've got a problem in your supply chain. But who are we to say what a company should do to provide remedy to the people that are affected in the supply chain? So if you talk to a company, first talk about to the affected stakeholders or a representative of the stakeholder to understand what the company did against those people, understand what those people actually need to get over it, need to find a remedy of this company. And that's a very important one, I think. And for example, when we talk about the engagement that we do on the Xinjiang region, it's a key element that we do there is we talk to representative of people that were hurt in Xinjiang. We talk to representative of the Uyghur people to understand what they need from the companies. And lastly, which I already mentioned, is collaborate. Collaborate because together we can increase our leverage and we can also share our knowledge. If I investigate one company on a certain human rights issue, it can take sometimes 2 days for me to only understand how the company impacted a certain community. And I think it's quite nice if I can call up a conculega, a competitor, but is having the same values than me to, well, what do you think about this? How do you see this issue? And can we engage on this together? Because I think only then can we actually have an impact. So that was my key message, and I hope you enjoyed it. Open for questions later during the debate. Thank you.